Welcome dear learners, I am Dr. Sylvia, Associate Professor in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition. In the previous module, we have discussed that respiration is an indispensable and life-sustaining process. We have dealt with the definitions and explanations relating to respiration and described the structural anatomy of the respiratory tract. This picture of the respiratory tract would help you to recollect the parts of the respiratory system. Today, we will discuss about the mechanism of respiration. This module aims to describe the movements of the respiratory tract, outline the operation of respiratory pressures, describe the role of the ribs, sternum and muscles, and finally explain the work of breathing. This module on the mechanism of respiration is a part of the paper on human physiology. It describes the movements and operation of the breathing mechanism. It will enable you to define and comprehend the terms associated with the mechanism of respiration, explain the types and mode of operation of respiratory pressures, describe the role of respiratory muscles and the diaphragm, and explain the actual work and energy needed for breathing. Now learners, I am sure you have heard the terms mechanics and mechanism oftentimes. Have you ever thought about their true meaning? Well, the term mechanics refers to the study of motion, and the term mechanism can be described as a set of moving parts in a machine that is set to perform a specific task. Under this module on the mechanism of respiration, we will deal with both the mechanics of breathing, that is, the physical properties of the lungs, airways and the chest wall, that is, how the body moves air in and out of the lungs, and the movements of the organs which take part in the process of respiration. The mechanical properties of the lungs can be studied in two conditions. The first is to study the properties of the static lung, that is, when air does not flow into the lungs, and the properties of the dynamic lung, where air flows in and out of them. For the ease of comprehension, let us categorize the phenomenon under four headings, that is, firstly, the act of respiration comprising of inspiration, that is taking in fresh air, and expiration or expelling stale air from the lungs. Secondly, the respiratory pressures. There are two types of pressures exerted in the thoracic cavity and the lungs during the process of respiration. One is the intrapleural or intrathoracic pressure, and the next is the intraalveolar pressure or the intrapulmonary pressure. The third factor is the expansibility or compliance, that is, the ability of the lungs and the thorax to expand in relation to the intraalveolar pressure and the intrapleural pressure. Last of all, we will try to understand the actual work of breathing accomplished by the respiratory muscles, and finally the two types of breathing. To begin with, let us recall the anatomy of the respiratory passages and the steps in the act of respiration. In the previous module, we have discussed that air moves in through the conducting and respiratory zones, and the actual exchange takes place in the respiratory unit. You might also remember that inspiration is taking in fresh air into the lungs and expiration is expelling stale air from the lungs. During quiet or tidal breathing, inspiration is an active process due to contraction of inspiratory muscles, followed by the passive process of expiration due to elastic recoil of the lungs. Secondly, we have to know about the respiratory pressures which operate respiration. There are two types of pressures exerted in the thoracic cavity and the lungs during respiration. One is the intrapleural or intrathoracic pressure, and the other is intraalveolar or intrapulmonary pressure. The third factor which governs the respiration mechanism is the expansibility or compliance, that is the ability of lungs and thorax to expand in relation to intraalveolar pressure and intrapleural pressure. Lastly, we should understand the work of breathing accomplished by the respiratory muscles and the actual utilization of energy. The act of respiration takes place through the muscles and the movements associated with inspiration and expiration. The muscles of respiration fall into four categories, namely the primary inspiratory muscles, the accessory inspiratory muscles, primary expiratory muscles, and the accessory expiratory muscles. From the diagram, you can see that the primary inspiratory muscles are the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles, which act during normal respiration. They are supplied by the phrenic and the intercostal nerves respectively. Accessory muscles assist in forced inspiration. These are the scalene, sternocleidomastoid, anterior serrate, and the elevators of scapulae and pectorals. In this picture, you can see the muscles of respiration. The scalene muscles of the neck are inserted into the upper two ribs. They are brought into play during deep breathing. They elevate the upper part of the rib cage to further increase the thoracic volume. Sternocleidomastoids are inserted into the upper two ribs and top of the sternum. These muscles lift the sternum outward and elevate the rib cage. This contributes to the pump handle effect and increases the thoracic volume, as you can see in the figure. Contraction of neck and back muscles during forced inspiration increase the thoracic volume in two ways. Firstly, they elevate the pectoral girdle, that increases the cross-sectional area of the thorax, and secondly, they extend the neck and increase the vertical length of the thorax. Next, we will deal with the muscles of the upper respiratory tract, which are the alae nasi, as you can see from the diagram, consisting of the major and minor alar cartilages. The levator palate or the cheek muscles, as you can see in this figure, the muscles of the upper respiratory passages, which are mostly the platysmal muscles. Their contraction decreases airway resistance and facilitates respiration. The primary expiratory muscles are the internal intercostal muscles innervated by the intercostal nerves. The accessory expiratory muscles are the abdominal muscles, which are depicted in this figure. Here you can see the internal oblique, the transverse abdominis, external oblique, and the aponeurosis of the external oblique. The muscles of the abdominal wall, which take part in expiration, are the internal oblique and the transverse abdominis. Contraction of these muscles increases intra-abdominal pressure and pushes the diaphragm up into the chest cavity. This decreases the rostrocaudal diameter of the thorax and increases intrapleural pressure. Next, we move on to the movements of the respiratory organs. Here you can see a diagram of the thoracic cage. Changes in the size of the thoracic cage occurs because of the movements of four structures or parts: the thoracic lid, the upper costal series, the lower costal series, and the diaphragm. The thoracic lid is formed by the manubrium sterni and the first pair of ribs. It is also called the thoracic operculum. Due to the contraction of the scalene muscles, the first ribs move upwards to a more horizontal position. The movement of the first ribs draws the manubrium sterni upwards and forwards, increasing the antero-posterior diameter of the thoracic cage. The upper costal series is constituted by the second to sixth pair of ribs. The contraction of external intercostal muscles causes the elevation of these ribs and the sternum moves upwards and forwards. This movement is called the pump handle movement. The pump handle movement increases the anterior posterior diameter of the thoracic cage. Simultaneously, the central portions of these ribs move upwards and outwards to a more horizontal position. This movement is called bucket handle movement, and it increases the transverse diameter of the thoracic cage. The lower costal series is constituted by the 7th to the 10th pair of ribs. These ribs also show bucket handle movement by swinging outward and upward. This movement increases the transverse diameter of the thoracic cage. Here you can see how the bucket handle movement increases the lateral dimension of the rib cage. The 11th and 12th pair of ribs are called the floating ribs, which are not involved in changing the size of the thoracic cage. The diaphragm is normally a dome-shaped structure with convexity facing upwards. During inspiration, it contracts and the muscle fibers are shortened, but the central tendinous portion of the diaphragm is drawn downwards so that it is totally flattened. This flattening of the diaphragm further increases the vertical diameter of the thoracic cage. From the diagram below, we can observe that the thoracic volume changes depending on the movement of the diaphragm. Let us now move further and understand how the lungs are kept partially inflated, that is, in apposition even at the end of expiration. For easy understanding, we usually discuss the anatomy and gaseous exchange in the lung as if the lung was a single giant alveolus. In reality, the lung is made up of millions and millions of tiny air sacs, as you have observed in the figure, each of which is fluid lined and also air filled. The elastic property of the lung is a combination of the elastic fibers throughout the alveolar wall and surface tension of the alveolar lining fluid, molecular interactions resulting from hydrogen bonds between water molecules in the liquid and the air. The lungs are under constant threat of collapse, even under normal condition of respiration. During inspiration, due to the enlargement of the thoracic cage, negative pressure is increased in the thoracic cavity. It causes expansion of the lungs. During expiration, the thoracic cavity decreases in size to the pre-inspiratory position. The pressure in the thoracic cage also comes back to the pre-inspiratory level. It compresses the lung tissues so that the air is expelled out of the lungs. This expulsion is because of two factors, namely the elastic properties of the lung tissues and the surface tension of the alveolar fluid. The elastic tissues in the lungs show constant recoiling tendency and try to collapse the lungs. The surface tension or the pressure exerted on the surface of the alveolar membrane by the fluid secreted from the alveolar epithelium, that causes the surface tension between gas and liquid in a fluid lined atmosphere, namely in the alveolus. The collapsing tendency of the lungs is prevented by two factors, namely the intrapleural pressure, which is the pressure in the pleural cavity as is depicted, and this pressure is always negative. This prevents the collapse of the lungs by causing the elastic recoiling of the lung tissue. The next factor is the presence of the pulmonary surfactant, which is the surface acting lipoprotein complex material secreted in the alveolar epithelium and lowers the surface tension of the alveolar fluid. It lines the epithelium of the alveolus and prevents the collapsing tendency produced by surface tension. The surfactant is composed of a surface active lipoprotein complex or phospholipoprotein formed by type 2 alveolar cells. The proteins and lipid fractions of the surfactant have both a hydrophilic region and a hydrophobic region. They adsorb to the air-water interface of the alveolus with the hydrophilic head groups in the water and the hydrophobic tails facing upward towards the air. The surfactant acts like a detergent. It reduces surface tension, reduces the work of breathing, prevents alveolar collapse, prevents alveolar flooding, and finally decreases the surface tension on the alveolar membrane. As you can see in the diagram, the surfactant is secreted by two types of cells, namely type 2 alveolar epithelial cells of the lungs, which are the surfactant secreting alveolar cells or pneumocytes. These cells have microvilli on the alveolar surface, and the Clara cells, which are situated in the bronchioles and are called bronchiolar exocrine cells. From the diagram below, you can have an idea of a healthy alveoli and an alveoli filled with liquid, as in the case of pneumonia. Moving on to the actual composition, pulmonary surfactant consists of 90% lipids and 10% protein. The phospholipids of the surfactant constitute about 75% of its composition. The major phospholipid of surfactant is dipalmitoyl phosphatidyl choline or DPPC. Here you can see the chemical structure of dipalmitoyl phosphatidyl choline, the major constituent of lung surfactant. The atoms are represented as spheres with a conventional color coding, hydrogen depicted by white, carbon by gray, oxygen by red, and nitrogen in blue, and phosphorus by the orange spheres. The other lipid substances in surfactant are the triglycerides and the phosphatidyl glycerol. There are four types of proteins in surfactant which are called as specific surfactant protein. They are SPA, SPB, SPC, and SPD. The SPA and SPD are hydrophilic, while SPB and SPC are hydrophobic. These proteins are vital to the surfactant. In their absence, the surfactant becomes inactive. The ions in the surfactant are mainly those of calcium. Next, we move on to the pressures which operate respiration, namely the intrapleural or intrathoracic pressure, the intraalveolar or intrapulmonary pressure, and the transpulmonary pressure. In this diagram, you can see depiction of the three types of pressures. From the diagram, you can also see that the intrapleural pressure is the pressure in the pleural cavity or the region between the visceral and the parietal pleural layers. It is called the intrathoracic pressure since it is exerted in the whole of the thoracic cavity. Normally, respiratory pressures are expressed in relation to atmospheric pressure, which is 760 milligrams of mercury. The intrapleural cavity is lined by a thin layer of fluid secreted by the visceral layer of pleura. This is constantly pumped into the lymphatic space from the pleural cavity, and this pumping phenomenon causes the negative intrapleural pressure of -4 millimeters of mercury. The negativity of the intrapleural pressure prevents the collapse, which is caused by the elastic recoil of the lungs. It also causes dilation of the larger veins and the vena cava. It is responsible for the venous return, that is, It acts as a suction pump and pulls the venous blood against gravity from the lower parts of the body towards the heart. It is therefore called the respiratory pump for venous return. The pressure in the alveoli is called intraalveolar or intrapulmonary pressure. It is normally equal to the atmospheric pressure, that is 760 millimeters of mercury. It is negative during inspiration and positive during expiration. The intraalveolar pressure causes airflow in and out of the alveoli. During inspiration, since the alveolar pressure is negative, the atmospheric air enters the alveoli, and when the intrathoracic pressure becomes positive during expiration, the air is expelled out of the alveoli. It also helps in the exchange of gases between alveolar air and blood. Lastly, we have the third type of pressure which brings about respiration, that is the transpulmonary pressure. The difference in pressure between the alveoli and the outer surface of the lungs, or the difference between the intraalveolar and intrapleural pressure, is a measure of the elastic forces in the lungs and is responsible for the collapsing tendency of the lungs. Here you can see the diagram representing the three operating pressures. Next, we move on to the third aspect, which is the expansibility or compliance of the lung. Pulmonary compliance or lung compliance is a measure of the lung's ability to stretch and expand. In clinical practice, it is separated into two different measurements, namely static compliance and dynamic compliance. Static compliance is the change in volume of the lung tissue for any given applied pressure. Dynamic compliance is the compliance of the lung at any given time during actual movement of air. Pulmonary compliance is calculated using the equation compliance is equal to delta V by delta P, where delta V is the change in volume for change in pleural pressure. Static compliance represents pulmonary compliance during periods without gas flow, such as during the inspiratory pause. It can be calculated using the formula C stat is equal to Vt over P plat minus PEEP, where P plat is equal to the plateau pressure and the positive end expiratory pressure, which is represented as PEEP. P plat is measured at the end of inhalation and prior to exhalation using an inspiratory hold maneuver. During this maneuver, airflow is transiently discontinued and eliminates the effects of airway resistance. Next is dynamic compliance or the compliance of the lung during respiration. Dynamic compliance represents pulmonary compliance during periods of gas flow, such as during active inspiration. Dynamic compliance is always less than or equal to static lung compliance. It can be calculated using the equation where C dyn is equal to dynamic compliance, Vt is the tidal volume. PIP or peak inspiratory pressure is the maximum pressure during inspiration, and PEEP is positive end expiratory pressure. Thus, C dyn is equal to Vt over PIP minus PEEP. The alterations in airway resistance, lung compliance and chest wall compliance influence the compliance during the dynamic airflow. The next aspect we deal with is the work of breathing. Work of breathing is the effort required to inspire air into the lungs or the work done by the respiratory muscles during respiration to overcome the resistance in the thorax and respiratory tract. It accounts for 5% of the total body oxygen consumption in the normal resting state. It increases dramatically during acute illness. The total expenditure of energy necessary to accomplish the act of breathing may be computed in terms of the pulmonary pressure multiplied by the change in pulmonary volume or in terms of the oxygen cost of breathing. During respiration, air is utilized to overcome three types of resistance. One is the airway resistance, or the resistance to the passage of air through the respiratory tract, which increases during bronchiolar constriction and increases further the work done by the muscles during breathing. The work done to overcome the airway resistance is called airway resistance work. Second is the elastic resistance of lungs and thorax. This is the energy required to expand lungs and thorax against the elastic force. The work done to overcome this elastic resistance is called compliance work. The third factor is the non-elastic viscous resistance. This is the energy required to overcome the viscosity of the lung tissues and those of the thoracic cage. The work done to overcome the viscous resistance offered by the tissues of the lungs and the thoracic cage. Finally, let us discuss about the types of breathing. Physiologically, breathing is of two types, abdominothoracic and thoraco-abdominal. Abdominothoracic breathing is usually observed in males. During inspiration, the diaphragm descends and pushes the abdominal viscera down, and therefore abdominal wall is raised and abdominal movement is prominent. The diaphragm is more powerful in males, and this contributes to the abdominothoracic breathing in males. Thoraco-abdominal or seesaw type breathing is seen in females and children. The movement of the chest wall in this type of respiration is prominent. The descent of diaphragm is resisted by the abdominal viscera. There is increased movement of the rib cage, and this increases the thoracic cage volume. Hence, the thoracic movement becomes prominent during breathing. From the above discussions, we can conclude that the mechanism of respiration is essentially a composite outcome of the interplay between the anatomical structures of the respiratory passages and the movement of air in and out of these structures in response to the operating pressures and the expansibility of the pulmonary tissues and organs. Thank you.